to the 18th is the holy day, which is Passover. And so therefore, what we're going to, excuse me, what we're going to do right now is to talk about what Passover is and why it is what it is. We're going to give you a little history. We're going to talk about the Seders and the Passover Lamb, which is Christ Jesus. And our guest tonight is Rabbi Henry Morse, and he will be teaching us about the purpose of Passover and how it points to Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. And so I'm hoping that this is something that you will get familiar with and incorporate it into your daily, into your rituals, into your lifestyle, because this is something that God has stated that we need to follow his holy days, not man-made holy days. So we have to recognize that there are things that we talk about, like Easter, and we talked about Christmas before. We talked about these different holidays that, are man-made, and we want to be really able to know that God says these are his holy days. If we practice what God says to practice, then we will be blessed, okay? And we will be following his rules. Okay, so we don't want to follow man-made traditions, man-made rules. And again, as I stated before in past times, that we're mixing clean with unclean, holy and unholy, and that's not to be. Okay, so without any further ado, I will be introducing you to Rabbi Henry. Hello, good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure.
Okay, nice to have you. It's nice to see you again.
And also you. Mm-hmm. Just a few days we had a Passover celebration together that was just full of tremendous joy.
It was
really
awesome. It was awesome. It was awesome. And I thank you for sharing with us, your Jewish roots with us. And it is something that Christians, we need to recognize where we come from.
Well, the book of Romans is very, very clear about the concept of the grafted in branch in Romans chapter 11. And unfortunately, sad to say, and this is not to attack anyone, but so many who have called themselves believers have forgotten that they are grafted in to come alongside of Israel, not to replace Israel,
absolutely,
but to come alongside. And the book of Romans teaches us that the root bears you, you don't bear the root. It's a pretty obvious read, so I would encourage anyone to just read those passages, specifically from Romans 11. And it talks about the relationship. Ephesians chapter 2 also deals with the issue of the Jew and Gentile becoming one in Messiah. For those who don't know, I am what's known as a Messianic rabbi, which means I'm a rabbi who has come to faith in Yeshua. We call him by his Hebrew name. I believe he's the Messiah. My congregation is a congregation of Jews and Gentiles who accept him as the fulfilled Messiah of Israel. We're not Christians. We do not call ourselves Christians because that word doesn't mean anything anymore.
No, it doesn't.
Everybody will use it for every description. Every cult will use it as well.
Absolutely.
And their doctrines can be as aberrant as anything. They can believe in the Hale-Bopp comet. They have. There's been groups like that.
Absolutely.
But we prefer to call ourselves Messianic. It's an anglicized version of the word Moshiach, which means Messiah. We believe he is absolutely the fulfilled, prophesied Messiah, and that he's come the first time according to the scriptures, and he's coming again. And this is where Passover comes in, because every biblical feast found in Leviticus 23, again, to the audience, I'd encourage you to read all these. I will be reading some passages, but you need to go and read them yourself. They give a prescription. And in Hebrew, these biblical feasts are called the Moedim, appointed times and seasons. And what that means is that there were appointments that the children of Israel had to keep. And there were also appointments that could only be kept by the Messiah himself.
Right.
And that's what grounds our faith.
Absolutely.
It's a faith that is steeped in prophetic display. It's not just, I believe this. I mean, I was raised an Orthodox Jewish boy in Mattapan. I went to Fessenden Street Shul. I'm a local. Right. This was my community. And for a nice Jewish boy, I went from being a nice Jewish boy in the 70s to a backslidden hippie. I was a little wandering Jew, schlepping from coast to coast, hitchhiking. I was homeless. I did the whole Ganze Megillah, as we say in Yiddish. And then I came to the Messiah to understand him. But when I became a believer, I wasn't taught these. I had to really search these things out myself. People told me, oh, you're not a Jew anymore, you've become a Christian. And it always disturbed me. When did I stop being Jewish? Yeshua, the Jew, the most Torah-observant Jew, my Messiah, he's Jew. Paul, Rav Shaul, as we call him in Hebrew, another Jew. Every one of them, nice Jewish boys.
Yes.
I had a shirt made for my congregation, and it said, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, a nice Jewish family. He never introduced his mom and dad as Joe and Mary Christ.
Yes.
He was the Messiah of Israel.
Well, we have to recognize, because you keep using the word Messiah, and a lot of times people don't understand what Messiah means. Messiah means the anointed one, his anointing.
Yes.
And Christ is the Hebrew word or the Greek word?
It's the Greek word. Christos is the Greek word.
Messiah.
Right. But again, it all depends upon what filter you use. These were Jewish writers, and they wrote understanding the Gospels through its history, its culture, its language, and its idiom. So when you go to, for example, we look at all the things that we celebrate concerning the resurrection of Messiah. The death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah is intrinsically wrapped up into Passover, or as we say in Hebrew, Pesach. Once you take it out of the context of Pesach, it becomes polluted. I'll give you an example. I won't quote verbatim because it's a long quote. Constantine in 325 AD, he writes in his Nicene Council, which is, of course, when he was bringing the Western and the Eastern churches together under his rule. He says, let us now, and this is a close, it's not a verbatim quote, but it's close. Let us now separate ourselves from the heinous practices of the Jews, those odious people. And he now sets the date of the resurrection. He takes it from Passover and the holy day of Firstfruits, which is found in, of course, we know that in Corinthians 5, Yeshua is our Passover Lamb. In Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 15, he is the Firstfruits resurrected from the dead. We know that he fulfilled these holy days, which are found in Leviticus 23, but Constantine makes the decision, I'm going to separate them from the biblical feasts so that I can disassociate Yeshua, he calls him Jesus back then, from anything Jewish because he hated the Jews.
That much.
And now he sets the date of the resurrection, not according to the Moedim of Passover and Firstfruits, but he sets the resurrection on the first Sunday after the full moon of the spring equinox, which coincidentally coincided with Ishtar.
Pagan ritual.
Pagan ritual, the hollow day, and I call it not
holy.
Yeah, it's not holy. The hollow day of and I don't have time to get into that right now, but it's very easily discerned. You can look this up. Research it. The information's out there. It's everywhere.
It is.
So it now coincides with the holiday of Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, and hence, where do we get all of our, all the bunnies? I have a problem with a rabbit laying an egg.
I'm telling
I have
you,
chickens,
isn't that something?
I get eggs every morning, but I've never got an egg from a bunny.
Oh my goodness! So
It's all fertility.
That's fertility, queen, and that's Esther. The name
Ishtar.
Ishtar was her name,
the goddess of fertility.
Yes, and so then that's why we have Easter.
It's anglicized,
Yes. Okay.
Just like the name Jesus is anglicized from Yeshua, which means salvation.
Yeah. So I just want people to understand that there is a history behind Easter. Okay, and that is in a pagan ritual sense, whereas we have a holy day which God commands us to follow.
And it's appointed.
And
Leviticus
it's appointed
23.
Time. Yes. And so all during history, even Christ himself followed that. He
absolutely had to in order to be the Messiah. I'll give you an example. Why it's important to celebrate the holy days. Just think about this. It's Passover. The angel of death is coming. I say to the Lord, Lord, I'm going to be a little late. I got a couple of Shlemiel Egyptians I want to sell some swamp property to. I'm going to get a good deal. Hold the angel of death. I'll be there. I'm going to be about 2.5, 3 hours late. Just hold the angel of death for me. I'm coming, okay? No death. I'll be there. When the Lord said, be in the house, covered by the blood of the Lamb, come in under the blood, and have faith in the blood, you didn't mess around.
No.
You came in the appointed time. Everything that the Lord does is timely. Everything that he does, as we say in Yiddish, is not mitten drinnen, helter-skelter.
No.
It's all interconnected.
Orderly.
And it's orderly. He is not the author of confusion. And so we look at these. So for example, we even look at very specific details found in Exodus 12:5, he says, concerning the issue of the sacrifice lamb, your lamb shall be unblemished, a male a year old. You shall take it from the sheep or the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And then then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses which they eat it. Now, this is important to understand. Let's rid our mind of the Western calendar. Let's think of this from a Hebrew perspective.
Okay. Is it Nisan?
That's the modernistic name that's used. In the Hebrew, it's called Aviv.
Aviv.
It's the month of Aviv. It's the only month that actually has a name.
Okay.
And I'll explain why in a second. But on the 14th of Aviv, you must take the lamb, and usually between 12 and 6 is when they slaughter them. On the 10th of Aviv is when you choose the lamb, you bring it into your house, and you examine it for 4 days to make sure that it's without spot or blemish. When does Yeshua come in on the triumphal entry? He comes in on the triumphal entry on the 10th of Aviv, and then he's examined by Pontius Pilate, by Herod, by the Sanhedrin, by the people. And he's examined for the 4 days until the 14th of Aviv. And then on the exact evening, during the time when the lambs are being slaughtered, he comes in and he's crucified on the day of the sacrifice of the Passover lambs. Not around, not about, it's a little bit late. And what do? They make sure they take him down, he's already dead, off the cross, that he will not be hanging up over the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath that's happening, according to Leviticus 23, is called a Shabbaton. Whatever the day of the week it falls on, it is considered a high Sabbath. It doesn't matter, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Okay. It's a high Sabbath. So in this case, and we'll talk about why in a second, it falls on a Wednesday. It is a Sabbath. It's not the weekly Sabbath, the Friday night. It's the Shabbaton, the high Sabbath of the holy day. So he dies. They don't want him hanging up over the cross, on the cross, over the Sabbath of the holy day, because Leviticus tells us that the only work that can be done is the work that has to pertain to the preparation of the meal for the Passover. And he cries, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, on the 9th hour, when that's approximately, it corresponds to our 3 o'clock hour, and then shortly thereafter dies. Exactly at the time when the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. And dies before the Passover itself. And what does he say throughout every passage in the gospel? And I'll read a number of those passages if we have time.
Yes.
Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, 3 days and 3 nights, so must the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth, 3 days and 3 nights. And he rises 72 hours later, not Sunday morning, because not one of the 4 Gospels says he rose on a Sunday morning. He rises 72 hours later, in between the evening, as the sun is going down and as it's moving towards the Saturday evening, during the biblical feast of Firstfruits, or what we call Yom HaBikurim. And I'll read those passages too as well. And so he ends up being the Passover lamb because he dies when the Passover lamb is slaughtered, and he ends up becoming the firstfruits, according to Corinthians 15, the firstfruits resurrected from the dead, everything, as the scripture says, in its order.
Right.
Now that's critical, because he can't be either if he misses the appointment.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you know what? You've brought us to where we need to know Christ is fully part of this whole. He is the prophecy.
He's the prophesied one, yes.
He's the prophesied one who has fulfilled the
every
prophecy.
last biblical, yes.
Okay, and so now I want to go back just a little bit to the history of the Passover, going back to Moses and the plagues and so forth, so that people could get an idea of how this all started and why God had instituted.
Actually, I wrote about that in my first book, and if anyone's interested, I'll let you know about it later. But in Genesis chapter 12, the Jewish people are created. We use the term God chose the Jews. We don't. The word choose is not the same in the Hebrew mind in this context as we think in English. It's not that he chooses the Jews, but he creates the Jews. Because he says in Genesis 12, he says, I will make of you a great nation. And he says, I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you, and in you, Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. How are the nations blessed? They're blessed because through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 sons come the nation of Israel. And from the nation of Israel come the prophets. And from the prophets come the Messiah, who brings salvation to the whole world. So here we have the nation of Israel. They're in Egypt. Joseph, of course, is in Egypt. He's risen to the second in command of all of Egypt. Only in the name, it says, only in the fact that you are not called Pharaoh. He had that much power. He
was Pharaoh's son. He was Pharaoh's son.
No, not Joseph. You're thinking of Moses.
Moses.
Yeah, Joseph. Joseph is in Egypt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Joseph.
Yeah. Do you remember Joseph?
Yes,
right,
yes.
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
Joseph.
It gets confusing sometimes. Yeah.
But I wanted
Moses
to talk
yet.
about Moses. Okay,
Yeah, we're going to get there.
Let's get there.
Yeah.
Let's get there.
So now Joseph,
Yes.
of course, his family comes to Egypt. What ends up happening? A Pharaoh arises that does not know him, and he enslaves the Jewish people to make, of course, to make sure that they would be subdued and subjected and not rise up against Egypt.
Yes.
And then, of course, you have Moses, because Pharaoh commanded all the male children 2 years and under to be thrown into the Nile, and help me out with the word, I can't think of it in English. The ones who help give birth, the
midwives.
Midwives. I couldn't think of it in English. The midwives, of course, they played a fast one on Pharaoh, and they said the Jewish women are too hardy, and they have the births before we get there, and hence you have the birth of Moses. So the birth of Moses is...
And God blessed the midwives.
Yes, he blessed the midwives tremendously. Now, the Nile was considered a god. Every one of the 10 plagues is an attack on the gods of Egypt.
Absolutely.
So they have the frogs, they have the lice, they have the alligators. You know, all these things
blood.
are...
The blood.
The blood. These are all considered the gods. And so he actually says, I will, bring these plagues and smite the Egyptians. And of course, he denigrates what they think are gods. Right. The sun, of course, is darkened, Ra, the sun god. And so he's bringing these attacks against the Egyptians to show their gods are not gods.
Absolutely.
Moses, of course, being followed by Miriam in the bulrushes, comes to Pharaoh's daughter, and she believes that because he was delivered to her in the Nile, that he's a gift from the God of the Nile.
Right, okay.
And of course, she can tell he's a Hebrew child because he's circumcised. And so hence, they keep him anyways.
Right.
And then, of course, we know what ends up happening. He ends up seeing his brethren oppressed, and he ends up killing the Egyptian oppressor, and then he has to flee from Pharaoh. And then in Exodus chapter 3, it's not George Bush, but it's a burning bush. He speaks to him from a burning bush, and Moses, basically, I can see Moses going, you're talking to me? You want me to do what?
But let's just roll back for a minute because again, as they say, Passover, the last plague was the firstborn was to be killed.
Yes, the firstborn of every male
in
whatever
that
animal,
entire, animal, child, whatever, it was to be killed. And so that was God's judgment, on that. But he told the Israelites that if they would take a lamb and find one without spot or blemish or whatever, and then sacrifice that and put the blood
upon the doorpost,
which they said is the top and two sides, which makes a triangle. Okay.
Again, I want to be careful with that. We don't exactly know whether they did it in that configuration or not, or whether they did it in the top. Some things are speculative. It might well have been.
Okay, but anyways, they placed the blood, on the doorpost and the lamp, and then when they went into the house, the death angel passed
so they
over
had
them.
to have faith in the blood of the Lamb.
Yes.
They actually, for them, it's a foreshadow, it's a prophetic display.
Yes, of Jesus Christ.
Yes, of course. Yeshua in Corinthians 5 is declared our Passover Lamb sacrifice for us. Why would Paul, the Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul as we call him in Hebrew, why would he use that allusion to the Passover if he didn't understand the Yeshua fulfilling the Passover in every way?
Right.
And so they had to have faith in the blood of the Lamb. And so as the Lord spared the firstborn of all the children of Israel, the firstborn males. He didn't spare his own son.
No, he didn't.
I mean, what a greater prophetic display do we have right there. He spares the children of Israel and yet doesn't spare his own son.
It says, what greater love hath a man than he lays down his life for his friends.
Exactly.
And he calls us friends. And that's the most awesome display of love. You know, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. He sowed his son into this world for you and for me. You know, when we were just foreigners, when we were just, aliens against him, we were just really ruthless, because, no one really wanted to, in our former state, we were rebellious, against God. And so, but he did not care. He sowed his son before the foundations of this earth.
Right.
Before. And so therefore, when he did that, we now stand as a beneficiaries for everything else.
Because he looks at the blood.
Yes.
The blood. And the entire sacrificial system that was set up to show us and help us understand that the Lord is a holy, righteous Lord, and that he cannot allow sin in his presence.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, we are incapable of taking all that the Lord is into us. So we can't perceive all that he is, and he can't have sin in his presence. Therefore, we are incapable in our place that we are today to come before him. That's why Messiah had to die, because the holy, righteous justice of the Lord had to be fulfilled, and he could not have us presented to him in our unrighteous state. So therefore, even the word atonement in Hebrew, the word kipporah, means to cover. We are covered by the blood, just as the blood of the Passover Lamb covered us and saved us from death.
And of course, Jesus was sinless. He had no sin.
The spotless Lamb.
Spotless, and he was just the pure one.
Let me throw something out there.
He just, he was able to take all of that sin that we had, all the sickness, all the disease. I mean, he took that on the cross for you and for me and for every one of us. And that's so amazing.
All right, you ready for this? A lot of people don't think about this, and I know that this is not something that is in the mind of most Christians. Yeshua was the perfect Torah keeper. He was the only one on this earth that could, in totality, keep every command of the Lord. Which makes him, again, the righteous one. So he still had to make the decision. Because, again, was he not tempted by Satan? Of course he was. So he still had to make the decision not to sin before the presence of the Lord and not to break his Torah. All right, I'd like to share something about the beginning of how we understand when to celebrate Passover. And it'll also tie into the end time events when Messiah comes again. It's very cool. We call the first month the month of Aviv. He says in Leviticus 23, 5-6, in the first month, on the 14th day of the first month, at twilight, it is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month, it is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So it is the first month, and it is the only month in the Hebrew calendar that actually has a name. And the name is Aviv. We use the name Nisan, but the word Nisan actually comes from the Babylonian calendar when the Jews came out of Babylon. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishri, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, Shevet, Adar. Now, yes, I did say Tammuz. Who's Tammuz? Tammuz is the son of Nimrod. It comes from a Babylonian calendar. We go back to the biblical calendar, and the word Aviv has to do with the barley, the barley harvest. The scripture teaches us that the barley in the spring, of course we see it naturally as well, comes to a head, but is not quite ripe enough to eat. When we see a plentiful crop, and we see that the barley is in the head, but not ready to eat, you'd have to crack it, you'd have to roast it in order to eat it. Then we know that we look for the sliver of the new moon, which is called the Rosh Chodesh, because it's a lunar calendar. And then once we see that, then we're able to count 14 days to the day of Passover. Okay, that's really, really important, because the barley crop is the first crop in the spring, in Israel. The second crop is the wheat. And obviously, we know that in Massachusetts, even though spring is a metaphor for suffering in this state, because we never get it. It always holds off. We still know that we can always guarantee the spring's going to come when we see the trees start to blossom. So the Lord allowed the signs of the time for the spring to be obvious, the crop, and the barley crop being the first. Okay. Now, the word Aviv appears in the Torah 6 times, and I'm going to just give you those verses. I'm going to just read a few of them. He says in Exodus 9:31, the flax and the barley were smitten. So we know that during this time in Exodus, when the plague of hail came down, the flax and the barley were smitten. Why? Because the barley was in the ear, it was Aviv, and the flax was bold. So that means that they were ready. The idea of the flax being bold was that it was in the flour, but it wasn't in. So they were destroyed. So the first month is always determined, again, by the spring, and the spring is always determined by the barley harvest. So there's a number of other passages. For example, he says in Exodus 9:31, Exodus 13:4, Exodus 23:15, Exodus 34:18, Leviticus 2:14, Deuteronomy 16:1. So it's not just one verse. There's a number of other different verses that talk about how he says in Exodus 34:18, the feast of unleavened bread shall be kept. 7 days you shall eat the unleavened bread as I commanded you in the time of the month of Aviv. For in the month of Aviv you came out of Egypt. All right, now, had the word Aviv been translated into English instead of left transliterated, which means they took the Hebrew letters and transliterated them into English consonants, it would have said, for example, in Exodus 13:4, in this day you came out in the month of the fresh young ears of barley.
Wow.
Now, that's important, and I'll tell you why. No one was able to determine, when you lived in the land back then, when the Passover was coming until you saw the signs of the time.
Okay.
Why is that critical? Because what does Yeshua say in Matthew 24 about the coming of the Son of Man? No man knows the day or the hour, but he keeps warning us to look for the signs of the time. Even the barley harvest in preparation for the Passover was a prophetic display and a metaphor for the first coming of the Messiah. And what he was basically saying to the children of Israel is, you will not know when Passover is coming. You will not know when Messiah is coming unless you keep your eyes open to the signs of the times.
And
not only that,
spiritual eyes.
Yeah, spiritual eyes. Not only that, but you also have to remember that I am not giving you a date because I'm looking for you to disturb your calendar and your schedule for my coming. You will not know. Always be on alert. What does he say to the 10 virgins? 5 of them were foolish, 5 of them were wise. He told them to keep their wicks trimmed and their lamps full of oil. And so we are warned over and over, these prophetic displays, these metaphors. This is why understanding the Passover in its proper time in reference to the death, burial, and resurrection is critical, and not substituting it for a Constantinian construct or a Constantinian man-made date that has nothing to do with it. That's like saying to the Lord, thanks for the prophecies, but no thanks. Yeah. And then everyone wants to say, but it's the sentiment that counts. Go ahead and tell King Saul that. That's right. When he disobeyed the Lord. What did Samuel say to Saul? To obey is better than sacrifice. And the Lord doesn't, he's not looking to give us excuse. People say, well, I intended to do X, Y, Z, but you didn't do it. Exactly. So if you didn't do it, then you disobeyed. You're in disobedience. Another sign of time, scripture that I want to talk about was also when it says the sons of Issachar knew the times and seasons and what to do. And so when I look at that, I say, you have to be well aware of God's timing. We have to be well aware. We have to be on God's calendar. Right. We have to get off of the man-made
construct, like you said,
Yeah.
that way of their way of doing things and their way of being right, and get into God's way.
Substituting and thinking that it's acceptable, yeah.
Absolutely. We have to get onto His way. And then when we do that, then we are following His appointed times, and we're going by what God wants us to do. So Passover and then Pentecost.
Well, no, the next feast after that is what is known as Yom HaBikurim, first fruits.
Okay,
so
first fruits.
Now, here, this is why the Aviv barley is critical. The scripture lets us know very clearly. He says in verse 20 of Corinthians 15, he says, "Now Moshiach has been raised from the dead, a first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, also in Moshiach will all be made alive. But each in his own order. The Moshiach, the first fruits, after those who are the Mashiachs at his coming. Then comes the end." Now, during the spring, when this barley crop was coming, we were obligated to make an offering to the Lord of the barley harvest. So the Passover happens, and then he instructs us that we had to, on the first day, excuse me, I'm sorry, I had a little, from the water here.
That's all right.
A little attack. On the first day after the weekly Sabbath, the first day after the weekly Sabbath, we were to make an offering of the Aviv barley. It was to be called an omer. We were to take a big omer of barley, it's a measurement, and we were to bring it before the Lord, and the children of Israel were instructed that they could not eat of the crop until the omer was offered to the Lord as an acceptable sacrifice. Now this is critical, because that's our first fruits, that we wave the sheaf before the Lord.
Sheaf offering.
Now, the Lord and the Messiah had to raise on first fruits, and his sacrifice and resurrection had to be timed on that, so that his resurrection would be the first fruit, and then the rest of all humanity could be raised. So his life and his resurrection is a direct correlation to the first fruits of the barley harvest.
Absolutely.
All integrated.
It is. And the thing is that when he called for his disciples to go and to get the upper room so that they can sit down and have the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, that Last Supper was also Passover.
Actually,
the Passover.
That's a misnomer. I'll correct it.
Okay.
All right. This is going to get a little complex. There was a rabbinic tradition called a Seudat Mitzvah. A Seudat Mitzvah was a teaching celebratory meal.
Okay.
In Luke 22 specifically, when he comes together for the Lord's Supper, they're not actually celebrating the Passover. Because remember, after they're done, what do? They go to the Garden of Gethsemane. They fall asleep. Peter wakes up. He cuts off the servant's eye in the servant's ear. Then he goes for trial. Yeshua goes for trial. Then Simon of Cyrene carries his cross. How could that be the Passover when he had to die on the Passover? The rabbis concluded, that quite often after the end of a study, a very intensive time of study, or the reading of a tractate, they would have a celebratory teaching meal in preparation for the holy day or whatever event that was coming on. And so the actual night of that's happening in Luke 22, the Lord's Supper, was the Seudat Mitzvah, a celebratory teaching meal, because the disciples are thinking, well, he's going to be with us tomorrow night for the Passover. And so what he's doing is he's telling them all these things so that when the night of Passover comes, they will reflect back and go, this is what he meant. It wasn't the actual Passover. It was the celebratory teaching meal known as a Seudat Mitzvah.
So
and that you have to find in historical books like Alfred Edersheim would speak of this as well. You'd find material like this. And of course, the Talmudic sources, which, I'm not going to quote those right now, but, I can get those sources to you as well later.
Okay. I wanted to ask a couple of questions here. Now, with the Passover, what preparations are made for Passover, both in the time of Jesus and today?
Well, the first one is called the Bedikat Chametz. We prepare the home. Chametz is leaven. And, leaven, of course, makes things rise. And it's also in the scriptures compared to sin, because just as sin puffs up in our life and makes us rise to a place of, that's inordinate in our life. So leaven is considered to be comparable to sin. It's a metaphor for sin. And so we are to clean out all the leaven in our house. So, and as well as the fact that we were commanded to take matzah, which was called the bread of affliction, because we didn't have time to let our bread rise. And we had to leave Egypt with our staff in our hands, our sandals on our feet. We had to be prepared to, he says, gird your loins, which meant basically that they had to, what they would do is they would take the front of their robe, they would pull it to the back of their robe, they'd pull it to the front, and they'd almost tie it in a diaper.
Okay.
And so that meant, because you can't run and walk fast with,
flowing.
Exactly, with a flowing robe. So he's basically saying, get ready. For example, Peter, when he was fishing, he would do the same thing, gird up his loins, etc. And so we had to have our loins girded, staff in our hands. We had to have our matzah, of course, because we didn't have time for it to rise. And then we had to be prepared to leave as soon as the Lord said leave.
Okay.
I find it funny because people don't realize, too, the children of Israel, when they left, they despoiled the Egyptians. Do you remember that?
They took everything.
You know why?
Yes. Was that because of they had to get paid back?
They were getting paid for
everything
for all the years of slavery.
Yes.
Exactly. That was their back pay.
Yes.
That was their compensation package.
That was a good benefit package.
That was a workman's comp package.
It was. So in today's day and age, everything has to be cleaned out of the house.
All the leaven.
Everything that has leaven in it. And then we use the bread, the cracker.
The matzah.
Yeah, the matzah. Yeah. Okay, which is, I wish we had a picture. Oh,
yeah,
there it is right
there.
there.
It is right there.
Okay.
And the matzah is striped.
Yes.
It's pierced. It's unleavened. In the meal, we have to, after the meal, we break it. We take it out of what's known as a matzah. I should have brought this with me. We take it out of what's known as a matzah, which is a pouch that has 3 compartments. And we take out the middle one, which is called the afikomen. And we break it, we wrap it, and we hide it.
Okay.
And the middle matzah, at the end of the meal, has to be resurrected and brought back, which is a symbol of the Messiah. Striped, pierced, broken, wrapped, buried, and brought back. He's pointing to something. That's the matzah on there, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And is there anything else you're pointing to that I should look at? All right, I wasn't looking at the screen.
Else?
Okay, yes.
And that's the lamb
That's the
bone,
Seder
right?
plate.
The Seder plate.
That's called the zeroah. And the
Okay.
zeroah is a representation of the Passover Lamb. We no longer slaughter a lamb because we don't have a temple. And of course, for us who are believers in Messiah, Yeshua is our Passover Lamb. And then of course you have the charoset, which is a mixture of apples and honey and wine sometimes and nuts. And it is a mixture that represents what we used. It's supposed to represent the mortar that we made to put the bricks together for Pharaoh's pyramids.
But it was very sweet.
It's very sweet.
Yeah, it was
the reason why
delicious.
is because it is to represent that even the bitterest of toil is sweetened by the promise of redemption.
Oh, wow.
And then we have the moror, which is the bitter herbs.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is to you ate some that night?
I ate some of that. That was.
I love that stuff.
It was good.
Makes you cry.
My eyes teared up.
Yeah.
My nose opened wide. I was like,
it's a natural
my
decongestant.
goodness.
You gotta love it.
It is. It was good. It was.
And so we have that to remind us of the bitterness of the slavery that we went. And then, of course, we have the carpus, which is the green, which is parsley, to remind us of the fact that we're in the time of the spring, in the resurrection. There's new life in Passover, etc. And then they also have what's known as the betzah, the egg, or the hagiga, which is to represent the temple sacrifice that we mourn. We no longer have a temple. But for us who are Messianic Jews and Messianic Gentiles, we revel in the fact that Yeshua is our atonement. Right. And then the salt water there. And we dip the elements in the salt water to represent the tears that were shed in Egypt.
Right.
So each and every one of these are symbolic to the events that happened. There's nothing in the scripture that teaches us that we need to have an egg.
No.
Obviously, they're symbols and they're traditions, and they're good as long as we don't put the prescription on them that we must, that the Lord commanded, eat an egg on Passover.
That's right. And that's where the Sanhedrins and the different ones got in trouble because they just wanted to follow the law and their hearts were not.
Well, it wasn't so much that they wanted to follow the law. It's, when you look at, for example, the book of Matthew 23, the woes to you scribes and Pharisees, he's not rebuking them for following the law. He's rebuking them for adding to the law. It's called the ma'asim and the takanots, the amendments and the precedents set by rabbinic midrash or commentary.
I thought it was because they were putting the law over the God's ordinances.
If they had known the law, they would have recognized Messiah.
Yeah.
It was the amendments that they put to the law. You know, the Talmudic tradition that we have today, they call it the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, and they believe that this oral Torah also came down to Moses on Sinai. But that's not.
Now this is Seder. This is the Seder?
Seder.
Seder? Okay, yeah. So this is Seder.
Passover Seder,
okay, the Passover Seder, which was really good.
The order
and then
of
you
service.
Also have the wine. So tell us about that.
Well, the wine, there's 4 cups that we drink during the Passover Seder. The first cup is the Kiddush cup, the cup that makes the meal holy. We say the prayer, the Barucha. And then we have the cup of plagues where we rehearse the 10 plagues. We dip our finger in it and put a drop of wine on the plate to represent the 10 plagues that befell the Egyptians. Not because we're reveling in it, but we should be reminded that the Lord does not find joy in the destruction of the sinner.
Right.
And then after the meal, we have the cup of redemption, which is the cup that Yeshua took in Luke 22 to remind them that this cup represents the blood of the Lamb, which he was saying is now to be represented by this cup and fulfilled in his blood. And then after that, you have the cup of Hallel, which is the cup of praise.
Okay.
And so, and then there's a 5th cup that we don't drink. It's the cup of Elijah. We set aside a place setting for Elijah, who is to be the forerunner of the coming of the Messiah. We who know, of course, know Yochanan, John, fulfilled that role.
Absolutely. Well, so we sit down, we're having a meal, and we sit, and then there are blessings also that go along with that, right? And so in each one, and some is said in English and some in the
for us,
Hebrew.
we do it in Hebrew and English because I don't want people to miss out on the translation, the beauty of the translation.
Absolutely.
In a traditional Passover Seder, depending on how religious and how well-versed the family is, they'd say it totally in Hebrew.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Or in Israel, of course.
Well, of course, of course. One thing that I wanted to bring up, the unleavened bread, because they, like you said, the leaven means that you have the sin.
It's a representation of sin, yes.
But they also talk about the pride.
Pride puffs up like leaven.
Yes, and all that. So we have to think about how we deal with ourselves.
Ridding ourselves of pride.
Yes, of all that, because that's exactly why Lucifer fell.
Right. The pride that would puff us up. Exactly.
Yes, okay. How can our, okay. We did do the, okay.
Technical difficulty, please stand by.
Is it appropriate for Gentile believers to celebrate Passover? And does the New Testament say early Christians kept the Passover?
I don't think it's appropriate. I think it's critical.
All right.
The reason why I say that is because it keeps them focused on the prophecy and the fulfillment. And what does it say in the book of Deuteronomy? It says, Deuteronomy chapter 6, after the Shema, Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It says, and these things you shall teach your children when you sit, when you walk, when you rise in the way. Why? Because the next generation must know people are weak in their faith and don't know why they believe because they don't know these things.
That's right.
These things need to be perpetuated to all generations, and I believe it's critical. Am I making it an issue of salvation? Am I telling anyone they're going to burn in the fiery furnace because they didn't celebrate Passover? No. But what I'm saying is it's an issue of growth. Because when you look at the book of Acts, chapter 15, the restrictions that they put, because let's face it, the Jerusalem Council were trying to deal with, what do we do with all of these Gentiles who've come to believe in our Jewish Messiah? Of course, some of them, the Judaizers in the Jerusalem Council said, I know, let's circumcise them all. And they said, no, not for salvation, but they come to salvation by grace. And then they only gave them a very limited things to do, that they should abstain from fornication, meat strangled, offered to idols, and blood. And then the immediate next statement is, because Moses and the prophets are read in the synagogue weekly. So they're going to get saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. But how are they going to grow? They're going to grow by reading the Moses and the prophets and the Torah, because you couldn't go to your basic Bible book and scroll store and buy a pocket scroll New Testament.
Right.
It didn't exist.
Right.
The only scriptures that they had were the same scriptures that Paul says to Timothy, you from your youth have known those scriptures which were able to make you wise unto salvation. If you want to have a healthy and a strong apologetic and to be able to defend your faith prophetically, you don't need to blow this off. There's so much to this. I've only covered a minuscule amount.
Yes. But thank you so much. Right now, I want to show a little clip from Rabbi Khan, full Messianic Passover celebration with Rabbi Khan from the beginning. And please start that, please. And we're just going to take a couple of minutes of it. It'll come up on here.
All right. It'll come up eventually.
Yeah, so, but that was really, really something that I
And I want you just to really, more than anything that happens today, I want you to be in his presence and just let him speak to you. And he said, I've desired this Passover with you. And these are the exact words that he said when he picked up the cup. This is the first cup. There will be 4 cups. This is what the fullness of the communion. And he said these words, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, shehachiyanu, v'kimanu, v'higiyanu, lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who has preserved us alive, who has sustained us, and who has brought us to this day. We thank the Lord. This is the cup called the cup of sanctification. And we all may lift up this cup. This is the first cup, and we're only when we drink, we only drink when we do this all together. We'll only take some sips. We'll do it 4 times. So this is the first one. It says in Luke 22, when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he said, take this and share it among yourselves. This is the opening of the Passover, the first cup called the cup of sanctification. And he said, these are his exact words. He said this, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, borei peri hagafen. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. And we partake the first cup. Passover is about life, death, redemption, resurrection. You see the symbols on here. This is called the karpas. This is the symbol of spring, that in God there's a new beginning, and that's what this is all about. God always gives new beginnings.
Thank God.
And here is spring, but it's also a symbol of the hyssop, where they dipped the blood of the lamb on the doorposts in Egypt. This is called the haroset, which is the bitter herbs. The Lord said, you will eat this with bitter herbs. And the point is, the Lord wants us to remember what we never have to live in again. And this is what he has saved us from. So this remembers for the Egyptians, this was the pain of Egypt, the sorrow of the Israelites, and in the Lord spiritually, this is the sorrow of sin that God has removed from our life. This is called, this was the maror, bitter herbs. This is called the haroset, and that is a mixture that's to look like the mortar that was done in Egypt that they put on the bricks. And this actually tastes sweet, even though it's representing the bondage of Egypt and the bondage of sin. It represents all the works that we have done that are now removed from our lives. And then we have this is the salt water, which represents the tears of Egypt and the tears of sin that the Lord turns into joy in the end. And this is called the beitzah, which is the egg, and it represents again birth, new birth. Israel is in a sense born again, and all God's Israel who are born again when you come to Messiah. And it's also roasted. That's why it's not an Easter egg. It's roasted because it also represents the sacrifice of the lamb, which has been gone for 2,000 years. There's no temple. There's been no lamb sacrifice because a lamb has come. And then this is kind of a mystery. This is called the Zoroah. We were going to talk about it last time, but we didn't have time, so we're going to talk about it now. But this is a mystery here we will get to. And then we have...
Hi, and welcome back to the Petra Destinee program with Rabbi Henry.
We're back.
We are so glad that you have come in to listen to us and to hear from this young man. Rabbi Henry Morse is an ordained Messianic rabbi with a degree in Bible and theology from Central Bible College in Springfield, Missouri. He has been in full-time ministry for over 30 years. He has served as a youth minister, evangelist, missionary, and congregational leader. He lives in Stoughton, Mass. with his wife, Sherry. So this man, right, that God hooked us up with each other. He hooked us up because God knows
Lord,
how to do that. So it was so good for me to meet him on Sunday and for him to be here today to share his experience with us. And we appreciate that.
Bless you. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I hope this will be a blessing to everyone. I hope that everyone will understand the importance of this. We're not putting this upon people for the purpose of religious duty. We're telling them that this will increase their love and their devotion, understanding of the character of the Lord.
Amen. So good night to all, and thank you for tuning in, and you have a blessed Passover and shalom.